As officials in the U.S. scramble to respond to two devastating hurricanes in less than a month, they are warning that viral misinformation and straight-up falsehoods are complicating recovery efforts.
This has to stop, because if it continues, we will see more and more people not trusting their federal government to be able to give them what they need.
That's a FEMA administrator. U.S. President Joe Biden, local governors, experts say that online claims about things like weather machines and funding policies at FEMA are making it more difficult for emergency responders. It also confuses people in need and even leads to threats to FEMA staff. So joining us this morning on where misinformation and disinformation is coming from and why and the harm that it causes is Amber Silver, assistant professor at the University of Alabama's Department of Emergency Management and Homeland Security. Welcome to Your Morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, we've been showing it all morning long and in the weeks before. The U.S. just hit by these two unprecedented hurricanes in less than a couple of weeks. First of all, go through for us what sort of misinformation and disinformation is out there right now about these disasters. People at home have probably seen some of these things pop up on their social media feeds.
Of course. So longstanding research and conventional wisdom tells us that misinformation is relatively common in the aftermath of large-scale disasters such as hurricanes Helene and Milton. But what's unusual with these storms is the volume of misinformation and the vitriol surrounding it. We are getting misinformation, a lot of misinformation about federal response. So, for instance, accusations that President Biden isn't accepting phone calls from governors of the affected states, or that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, is directing relief funds away from Republican survivors, even outlandish claims such as these storms were geoengineered specifically to kill Republican voters in the lead up to a federal election.
You know, and some of those things sound very far-fetched. However, they weave them in with an element of truth, like, yes, this storm is devastating, or yes, this is what it will cause. But the intention behind it is where the misinformation comes into play. What are the main things that these viral claims are getting wrong about the response, first of all, to these hurricanes? We heard President Trump recently talking about FEMA, saying that if you're trying to get your money from FEMA for recovery, you won't get it because a lot of it's gone to migrants.
Yeah, so you're entirely right. So with federal response, so FEMA was posed to respond to Hurricane Helene and to Hurricane Milton in advance of the storms even making landfall. The $750, there's a lot of misinformation about the $750 relief funds, saying that this is the only funding or the only relief funds that survivors will receive. And of course, that's not true. And so FEMA has been very responsive. The administrator of FEMA has been very vocal about the work that FEMA is doing. FEMA even has a website dedicated to debunking misinformation, which is so important in the aftermath of these storms.
It is so important, but if people are being told not to believe FEMA, they're not going to also believe the information that FEMA has on their website. The other one that comes up a lot is based a little bit in science that does exist, which is about cloud seeding, where you pump up a cloud and enforce rainfall, which is used by farmers already. And I see this one a lot about the government has seeded the clouds to create these hurricanes.
Yeah, that is unfortunately, especially with Hurricane Milton, a part of the discourse that's becoming very prevalent, this idea that the government has seeded these clouds specifically with the intention of impacting red states in the lead up towards an election. Patently untrue, of course. Hurricanes are massive systems. The physics there, it's impossible. Yeah. But for some reason, that narrative has taken hold and has been making its rounds.
You know, I find it so curious that we see it in healthcare and we see it in politics. This is the first time in like 20 plus years I've ever seen this kind of campaign around weather. Where does that mistrust come from?
So that's a really great question. The reality is that, as with many storms, misinformation is being shared by sort of Jane and John Doe average citizen, of course. And very often it's occurring, like it's being shared by these individuals with the best intentions. So they think it's true or they think it's helpful. What's alarming with Hurricane Helene and Milton is that misinformation is also being shared by people who have been elected to the highest offices in this country. I'm thinking specifically of former President Trump, who accused the federal government of not providing relief to Republicans in the hardest hit areas of the states. I'm thinking also of Georgia Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene, who is saying that these storms are geoengineered and that they're being controlled by the government. When elected officials make these baseless claims, that has very real impact in a way that a member of the public sharing misinformation does not. There is an element of trust there. And so there's more credence when misinformation is shared by people who hold those offices.
Yeah, and we talk about mis and disinformation because misinformation has a misunderstanding of facts. Disinformation is, well, straight up lies. University at Alabama Assistant Professor Amber Silver, I want to thank you for joining us. Important conversation to have this morning.
Thank you so much.
If you liked that video, make sure to subscribe to the Your Morning YouTube feed where you can find all kinds of new content posted every weekday morning.